6 months ago, my boss laughed as he slid termination papers across the conference table, telling me my code was legacy garbage that belongs in a museum. Today, their $300 million app won't process a single payment without it, and I'm watching their entire empire crumble in real time. Here's how I turned getting fired into the most expensive lesson in tech history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I wasn't supposed to make it this far. Growing up in Mesa, Arizona, the daughter of immigrant parents who owned a small Mexican restaurant called Corazón, I learned early that everything worth having required twice the effort and 3 times the proof. While my classmates spent summers at the community pool, I was debugging my first lines of code on a secondhand laptop my dad bought from a pawn shop, teaching myself programming between shifts, helping my mom count receipts and balance the register. The restaurant industry runs on razor-thin margins, and I watched my parents struggle with every payment processor fee, every transaction cost that carved away at their already modest profits. When a customer paid with a credit card, I'd see my mother's face tighten slightly, knowing that 2 or 3% of that sale would disappear into the black hole of processing fees. Those moments planted a seed in my mind that would eventually grow into something much larger than I could have imagined at 15. Arizona State University became my launching pad, though it nearly broke me financially. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my computer science degree: mornings at a campus coffee shop, afternoons tutoring struggling calculus students, and weekends doing freelance web development for local businesses. My dorm room looked like a command center, with multiple monitors displaying code, textbooks stacked like skyscrapers, and empty energy drink cans creating a metallic fortress around my desk. My roommate Sarah used to joke that I spoke more Python than English, and she wasn't entirely wrong. During my senior year, I threw myself into my master's thesis with the intensity of someone who knew this was my one shot at changing everything. The project focused on secure payment processing algorithms, specifically developing fraud detection systems that could learn and adapt in real time. Traditional systems flagged transactions based on static rules, but mine used machine learning to understand spending patterns and identify anomalies with unprecedented accuracy. I called it Vault Core, and it represented 18 months of sleepless nights, countless failed experiments, and breakthrough moments that made me forget to eat for entire days. The algorithm wasn't just academically impressive, it was revolutionary. During testing, Vault Core caught fraudulent transactions 40% more accurately than existing industry standards, while reducing false positives by nearly 60%. This meant fewer legitimate purchases getting declined, and more actual fraud being stopped before it could damage accounts. My professor, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, called it the most practical and potentially valuable thesis work she'd supervised in 20 years. The university filed a provisional patent, with my name listed as the primary inventor. After graduation, landing a position at Streamline Apps felt like winning the lottery. Austin's tech scene was exploding, and Streamline Apps sat at the heart of it all, occupying a gleaming 25-story building on Congress Avenue, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of Lady Bird Lake. Their flagship product, PaySwift, processed over 15 million transactions monthly, moving roughly $300 million through their systems every 30 days. For a girl who'd grown up watching her parents count quarters, those numbers felt surreal. My interview process lasted 6 hours and included live coding challenges that would have intimidated developers with decades of experience. I solved algorithm problems while senior engineers watched over my shoulder, debugged intentionally broken code under time pressure, and designed scalable architectures on whiteboards that stretched across entire conference room walls. When they offered me a senior developer position focused on payment security, I nearly cried right there in the lobby. The early days at Streamline Apps were intoxicating. The company culture embraced innovation and rapid iteration, with developers encouraged to experiment and push boundaries. My cubicle sat in the heart of the engineering floor, surrounded by brilliant minds who spoke in programming languages and thought in algorithms. The ping-pong tables and kombucha on tap felt like luxuries compared to my college dining hall existence. But what really energized me was the work itself. PaySwift's existing fraud detection system was functional but predictable. It relied on rule-based logic that flagged transactions exceeding certain amounts, coming from foreign countries, or matching predetermined suspicious patterns. The system worked, but it was rigid and often wrong. Legitimate customers found their cards declined when traveling or making unusual purchases, while sophisticated fraudsters learned to stay just below the thresholds. The user complaints flooded in daily, and customer service spent countless hours explaining why someone's grocery purchase in a new city had been rejected. I saw an opportunity to implement VaultCore's adaptive learning approach within PaySwift's existing infrastructure. Rather than proposing a complete overhaul that would require months of development and extensive testing, I suggested integrating my algorithm as a secondary layer that could work alongside the current system. This approach would allow us to compare results in real time while minimizing risk to the production environment. The integration project consumed my first year at Streamline Apps. I arrived early and stayed late, methodically adapting VaultCore's core logic to work within PaySwift's architecture. The existing codebase was complex and sometimes contradictory, built by multiple development teams over several years without consistent design patterns. Some modules were elegantly crafted, while others looked like they'd been cobbled together during weekend hackathons. Making VaultCore communicate effectively with this diverse ecosystem required patience, creativity, and occasionally complete rewrites of functional but poorly structured code. My breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating debugging session on a rainy Thursday evening. The office had emptied hours earlier, leaving me alone with the hum of servers and the soft glow of multiple monitors displaying scrolling error logs. VaultCore was rejecting legitimate transactions at a rate that would never pass production testing, and I couldn't understand why. The algorithm worked perfectly in isolation, but something about PaySwift's data structure was confusing the machine learning model. Then I noticed something in the transaction metadata that everyone else had overlooked. PaySwift's database included dozens of data points for every purchase: timestamp, location, merchant category, payment method, user history, and more. Most developers focused on the obvious fraud indicators, but VaultCore could analyze patterns across all available data simultaneously. The problem wasn't with my algorithm, it was with how we were feeding it information. I spent the next 3 weeks restructuring the data pipeline, creating what I privately called the neural pathway between PaySwift's transaction engine and VaultCore's analysis brain. Instead of sending isolated transaction details, the new system provided comprehensive context that allowed VaultCore to understand not just what was happening, but why it was happening within the broader pattern of user behavior. The results were extraordinary. When we tested the updated system against 6 months of historical transaction data, VaultCore identified 97% of known fraudulent charges, while flagging only 2% of legitimate purchases for manual review. The existing system, by comparison, caught 73% of fraud while incorrectly flagging 8% of valid transactions. The improvement wasn't incremental, it was transformational. More importantly, VaultCore learned continuously. Each verified transaction, whether approved or rejected, taught the system something new about user behavior and fraud patterns. The algorithm evolved daily, becoming more sophisticated and accurate with every data point. Within 3 months of deployment, customer complaints about declined legitimate purchases dropped by 85%, while fraud losses fell to the lowest levels in PaySwift's history. My success didn't go unnoticed. The engineering team celebrated with pizza parties and congratulatory emails, while senior management began including me in strategy meetings previously reserved for directors and VPs. I received a substantial raise and a promotion to lead security architect, with my own team of junior developers eager to learn from VaultCore's success. But perhaps most meaningful was the impact on real users. Customer service forwarded me emails from small business owners who could finally accept payments without fear of arbitrary rejections, elderly customers whose purchases were no longer declined when they deviated from routine patterns, and international students whose transactions processed smoothly despite their unique spending behaviors. These weren't just technical victories. They were human victories that reminded me why I'd chosen this career path. During this period, I also began implementing VaultCore improvements that addressed specific pain points I'd observed in my parents' restaurant. Small merchants like them suffered disproportionately from payment processing issues because they lacked the volume and leverage to negotiate better terms with traditional processors. I quietly developed specialized algorithms that recognized and protected small business transaction patterns, reducing their false positive rates even further, while maintaining the same fraud protection standards. The work consumed me completely, but in the best possible way. I'd found my calling in creating technology that solved real problems for real people. Every line of code I wrote felt purposeful. Every algorithm improvement had measurable impact. And every successful deployment brought me closer to my ultimate goal of using technology to level the playing field for businesses like my parents' restaurant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My confidence grew along with VaultCore's capabilities. I began speaking at local tech meetups, sharing insights about machine learning applications in fraud detection. The Austin development community embraced me as a rising voice in fintech, and recruiters from major companies started reaching out with increasingly attractive offers. But I was happy at Streamline Apps, building something meaningful within a company that seemed to value innovation and technical excellence. I should have paid more attention to the management changes happening above my head. The company was growing rapidly, attracting venture capital investment that came with pressure to scale quickly and show dramatic results. The relaxed, experiment-friendly culture that had allowed me to develop VaultCore was gradually being replaced by corporate structure and hierarchical decision-making processes. The first warning sign came when Harold Chen, our beloved CTO and my biggest advocate, announced his departure to join a startup in Silicon Valley. Harold had protected the engineering team from external pressure, ensuring we had the time and resources needed to build robust, well-tested solutions. His replacement was already chosen, Brad Thompson, a Stanford MBA with extensive experience in scaling high-growth technology organizations, according to the company-wide announcement. I met Brad during his first week, when he scheduled individual meetings with all senior engineering staff. His office was 3 times larger than Harold's had been, decorated with framed magazine covers featuring successful tech executives and motivational posters about disrupting the status quo. Brad himself looked like Central Casting's version of a tech executive. Perfectly styled hair, expensive casual clothing that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. Our conversation started pleasantly enough. Brad asked about my background, my work on VaultCore, and my vision for PaySwift's future security development. I explained the technical details enthusiastically, walking him through how machine learning could continue evolving to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated fraud attempts. I showed him the metrics demonstrating VaultCore's impact on both security and user experience, and outlined my roadmap for further improvements. But as I spoke, I noticed Brad's attention drifting. He checked his phone multiple times, glanced at his computer screen, and occasionally interrupted my explanations with questions that revealed he hadn't been listening. When I finished describing a particularly complex algorithm improvement, he leaned back in his chair and said, "That's great, Maya, but I'm more interested in what's next. How do we modernize this whole system?" The word modernize sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why at the time. I asked what specifically he meant, and Brad launched into a monologue about cloud-native architecture, microservices, and containerization that sounded impressive but lacked any concrete understanding of PaySwift's actual technical requirements. He spoke about legacy code as if it were a disease that needed to be cured, regardless of whether that code was functional, secure, or business-critical. I tried to explain that VaultCore's architecture was already optimized for scalability and performance, that the system could handle PaySwift's growth projections for years without major restructuring. But Brad had already moved on to his next topic: team reorganization. He wanted to bring in fresh talent from his network of Silicon Valley contacts, people who understood modern development practices and could inject some innovation into our engineering culture. Walking back to my desk after that meeting, I felt unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Nothing Brad had said was explicitly threatening, but something about his dismissive attitude toward existing systems and his emphasis on external hiring felt ominous. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my work, telling myself that new leadership always brought change, and change wasn't necessarily bad. Over the following weeks, I watched Brad implement his vision for Streamline Apps' engineering organization. He hired 3 new senior developers, all from prestigious tech companies in California, and promoted them to leadership positions within their first month. These newcomers arrived with strong opinions about best practices and industry standards, often dismissing existing approaches without fully understanding their purpose or effectiveness. The culture shift was immediate and jarring. Code reviews became exercises in architectural philosophy rather than practical problem-solving sessions. Meetings multiplied exponentially, with new processes for planning, tracking, and reporting that consumed hours previously spent writing actual code. The ping-pong tables remained, but the relaxed creativity that had once defined our work environment was replaced by corporate efficiency metrics and productivity dashboards. Most concerning was Brad's growing fixation on what he called, quote, technical debt. He commissioned a comprehensive audit of PaySwift's entire codebase, hiring an external consulting firm to identify areas requiring modernization. When the preliminary report arrived, Vault Core was prominently featured in the, quote, legacy systems requiring immediate attention section. The consultant's analysis revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Vault Core's architecture and purpose. They criticized the system for using outdated machine learning frameworks and non-standard integration patterns, without recognizing that these design choices were intentional and necessary for optimal performance. The report recommended replacing Vault Core with a, quote, cloud-native fraud detection solution that could be, Rasta report. Reading that report felt like watching someone dismiss a handcrafted violin as inferior to a mass-produced keyboard. Vault Core wasn't just code, it was art, science, and engineering combined into something that worked better than anything else in the industry. But to consultants who measured value in buzzword compliance rather than actual results, it was merely an obstacle to standardization. I requested a meeting with Brad to discuss the report's recommendations, hoping to provide context the consultants had missed. I prepared extensively, creating detailed presentations that explained Vault Core's technical advantages, demonstrated its superior performance metrics, and outlined the risks associated with replacing a proven system with untested alternatives. The meeting took place in Brad's office on a Tuesday afternoon, with two of his new senior hires attending as observers. I spent 45 minutes walking through my analysis, explaining why Vault Core's architecture was specifically designed to excel at fraud detection tasks, and showing concrete data about its impact on PaySwift's security and user experience. Brad listened politely, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before responding. Maya, I appreciate all the work you've put into this system, but we need to think about the bigger picture here. Vault Core might be effective, but it's also a black box that only you really understand. What happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? The bus scenario is a common argument in software development discussions, referring to the risk of critical knowledge being held by a single person. But in Vault Core's case, the concern was misplaced. I had documented the system extensively, trained other team members on its operation, and built monitoring tools that would alert administrators to any issues. The system was complex because fraud detection was complex, not because I had intentionally made it incomprehensible. I explained this to Brad, showing him the documentation I'd created and describing the training programs I developed for other engineers. But he seemed to have already made up his mind. The consultants are recommending we move to a more standard solution, he said, something that any qualified developer can work on without needing a PhD in machine learning. That comment stung more than I wanted to admit. I didn't have a PhD, and Vault Core's success came from practical engineering and careful attention to real-world requirements, not academic credentials. But Brad's dismissal revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of both the technology and the problem it solved. The meeting ended with Brad promising to, quote, consider all options while moving forward with the modernization initiative. I left his office feeling frustrated and concerned, but still believing that Vault Core's proven results would ultimately protect it from replacement. I was naive to think that technical merit alone would determine the outcome. Over the next several weeks, I watched Brad's modernization plans take shape. New development teams were assembled to work on next-generation payment security solutions, staffed entirely with his recently hired developers. Existing projects were deprioritized or canceled to free up resources for the new initiatives. The engineering organization that had once felt like a collaborative community was restructuring into competing factions. with clear divisions between Brad's inner circle and everyone else. I tried to stay focused on my work, continuing to improve Vault Core and support PaySwift's growing transaction volume. But the writing was on the wall, written in management consulting jargon and startup mythology that valued novelty over reliability. Brad was building his own legacy, and my outdated algorithms had no place in his vision of Streamline App's future. The end came sooner than I expected, but the signs had been there all along for anyone willing to see them. The conference room felt arctic, despite Austin's blazing June heat outside. I sat across from Brad Thompson, his two newest hires flanking him like well-dressed bodyguards, while the head of human resources shuffled papers nervously at the head of the mahogany table. The meeting request had come through email that morning with the innocent subject line Q2 performance discussion. But something about the formal tone and the inclusion of HR had made my stomach twist with dread. "Maya, we need to discuss your future here at Streamline Apps," Brad began, his voice carrying that practiced corporate smoothness that managers use when delivering bad news. The thick folder in front of him contained what looked like performance evaluations and legal documents, though I hadn't received any warnings or negative feedback in my 4 years with the company. My last review had been stellar, with Harold personally commending my work on Vault Core and recommending me for the technical leadership track. "I don't understand," I said, genuinely confused. The quarterly numbers showed PaySwift processing record transaction volumes with fraud rates at historic lows. Customer satisfaction scores were climbing monthly, and the security improvements I'd implemented had saved the company millions in potential losses. My performance metrics have consistently exceeded expectations. Brad exchanged glances with his companions before continuing. "Performance isn't just about individual metrics, Maya. It's about fit within the evolving organizational structure. We're moving in a direction that requires different skill sets, more modern approaches to problem solving." He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "We've decided to eliminate your position as part of our technology modernization initiative." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eliminate my position. Not reassign, not restructure, but eliminate entirely. I stared at the termination agreement, trying to process what was happening. The document outlined a severance package of 6 weeks' pay plus accumulated vacation time, along with the standard non-disclosure and non-compete clauses that would prevent me from discussing company business or working for competitors. "This is about Vault Core, isn't it?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "You want to replace my fraud detection system with something your consultants recommended. Vault Core is legacy technology." One of Brad's hires interjected, a thin man named Derek whose LinkedIn profile boasted about disrupting traditional paradigms at his previous companies. "The code base is monolithic, poorly documented, and built on outdated frameworks. It's exactly the kind of technical debt that's holding us back from true scalability." I felt heat rising in my chest. Poorly documented? I had created comprehensive documentation for every aspect of Vault Core, including architectural diagrams, implementation guides, and troubleshooting manuals. The system was modular by design, with clear interfaces between components that allowed for incremental updates and testing. These people had never bothered to understand what they were criticizing. "Vault Core processes $300 million in transactions every month," I said, trying to keep my voice professional, despite the anger building inside me. "It has the highest accuracy rates in the industry and the lowest false positive percentages. What legacy system are you replacing it with that can match those results?" Brad's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Maya, I appreciate your passion for your work, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. We need systems that can be maintained by any qualified developer, not specialized solutions that create single points of failure. Your approach works, but it's not sustainable in a modern development environment." The irony was staggering. Brad was firing me for creating technology that was too advanced for his team to understand, then calling it outdated because they couldn't replicate it. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent optimizing algorithms, the careful testing that had proven Vault Core's superiority, the user complaints that had disappeared after its implementation. None of that mattered to someone who measured value in buzzword compliance rather than actual results. "What about the transition period?" I asked, realizing that arguing was futile. VaultCore requires specific knowledge to maintain and update. The system is complex because fraud detection is complex. We've already contracted with a vendor who specializes in modern fraud prevention solutions, Derek replied dismissively. They'll be implementing a cloud-native platform that uses industry-standard APIs and machine learning frameworks. The transition should be seamless. I almost laughed out loud. Industry-standard fraud detection was exactly what VaultCore had been designed to surpass. These generic solutions were built for lowest common denominator implementations, providing adequate protection for companies that couldn't afford custom development. PaySwift would be trading a Lamborghini for a Honda Civic and calling it an upgrade because the Honda had newer cup holders. The HR representative, a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had always been friendly during company events, cleared her throat uncomfortably. Maya, you'll need to complete your final tasks today and surrender your access credentials. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings once we finish here. Security escort. The phrase made me feel like a criminal rather than an employee who had contributed 4 years of exceptional work. I thought about Jessica Chen, my mentee who was just starting to understand the intricacies of payment security, and the other junior developers who had relied on my guidance. They would wake up tomorrow to find their technical leader gone, replaced by consultants who spoke in acronyms, but had never built anything that mattered. I need to document the handover process, I said, grasping for some way to protect the work I'd built. VaultCore has operational procedures that aren't obvious from the code itself. The monitoring systems, the update protocols, the integration points with PaySwift's other components. Brad shook his head. The consulting team has already completed their analysis. They're confident they can handle the transition without additional documentation. We don't want to delay the modernization process. That was when I realized this wasn't just about replacing VaultCore. This was about erasing me entirely from Streamline App's history. Brad wanted a clean slate where he could take credit for whatever came next, without the inconvenience of acknowledging that the outdated system had been working perfectly. My termination wasn't a personnel decision, it was a narrative decision. I signed the papers because I had no choice, but I read every word carefully before putting pen to paper. The non-compete clause prevented me from working for direct competitors for 6 months, but it was narrowly defined to cover only companies in PaySwift's specific market segment. The non-disclosure agreement was standard corporate language that protected trade secrets and proprietary information, but didn't prevent me from discussing general technical concepts or my own professional experience. What struck me most was what the documents didn't mention. There was no reference to intellectual property ownership, no acknowledgement of VaultCore's origins, no discussion of the patents or academic work that had formed its foundation. Brad's legal team had focused on preventing me from competing or talking, but they had completely overlooked the question of who actually owned the technology they were about to depend on. The security escort turned out to be Mike Rodriguez, a kindly older man who had been with Streamline Apps since its early days. He helped me pack my personal belongings while apologizing quietly for the awkward situation. My desk had accumulated 4 years of memories, commendation letters from customers, thank you cards from colleagues, a small cactus that Sarah had given me when I moved to Austin, and dozens of technical books that had helped me solve various problems over the years. As I packed my things into a standard cardboard box, I noticed Jessica Chen watching from across the office floor. She looked shocked and confused, clearly having heard nothing about my termination until seeing me pack up. I caught her eye and mouthed, "I'll explain later," hoping she would reach out once the initial chaos settled. Jessica was brilliant and deserved to understand what was really happening, even if I couldn't discuss it openly while still in the building. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt eternal. Mike made small talk about the weather and weekend plans, clearly trying to make the situation less uncomfortable. I appreciated his kindness, but I was barely listening. My mind was racing through the implications of what had just happened, trying to process the professional and personal consequences of losing not just my job, but my life's work. Sitting in my car in the parking garage, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had occurred. 4 years of dedication, innovation, and success had been dismissed in a 30-minute meeting. Brad had reduced my contributions to technical debt and my expertise to, quote, single points of failure. The system that had revolutionized PaySwift's fraud detection was now considered legacy code that needed to be replaced by whatever cookie-cutter solution his consultants could implement. But underneath the hurt and humiliation, something else was building. Anger, yes, but also a cold determination that surprised me with its intensity. Brad had made a fundamental mistake in how he'd handled my termination. He had been so focused on eliminating the person that he had forgotten about the technology itself. Vault Core wasn't just code that could be replaced. It was intellectual property with a complex history that predated my employment at Streamline Apps. I drove home through Austin's afternoon traffic, my mind already shifting from victim to strategist. Brad thought he had removed an obstacle to his modernization plans. What he had actually done was create an enemy who understood his company's vulnerabilities better than anyone else in the world. Vault Core had secrets, and not all of them were documented in Streamline Apps' corporate repositories. Part 3. The Aftermath Storm. My East Austin apartment felt smaller when I walked through the door at 3 in the afternoon, a time I should have been deep in code reviews or debugging sessions. The converted warehouse loft that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a reminder of everything I'd lost. My laptop sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it that morning, next to a coffee mug that still held the remnants of my optimistic breakfast routine. Everything looked exactly the same, but the world had fundamentally shifted beneath my feet. I poured myself a glass of wine despite the early hour and sat on my couch, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Austin's skyline. The Streamline Apps building was visible in the distance, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon of technological progress. From this angle, it looked impressive and permanent, the kind of structure that would define the city's transformation into a major tech hub. But I knew what was happening inside those walls, the systematic dismantling of everything that had made PaySwift actually work. The silence in my apartment was oppressive. For 4 years, I had maintained a rhythm of early mornings, productive days, and evenings spent either socializing with colleagues or working on side projects that extended my technical skills. My identity had become inextricably linked to my work at Streamline Apps, to the point where I introduced myself at parties as Maya. I work on fraud detection at PaySwift. Without that context, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed with text messages as word of my termination spread through the engineering team. Jessica Chen sent a worried message asking if I was okay and whether we could meet for coffee. Marcus Johnson from the DevOps team expressed shock and offered to serve as a reference for job applications. Even Harold Chen, our former CTO who had left 3 months earlier, reached out from his new position in Silicon Valley with an offer to connect me with his network of contacts. But along with the supportive messages came others that stung more than I expected. Several colleagues sent generic, "sorry to hear about the layoffs" texts that revealed how Brad was spinning my termination. I wasn't being fired for performance issues or cultural conflicts. I was simply a casualty of corporate restructuring, an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice to the gods of modernization and efficiency. The narrative was clean and convenient, painting Brad as a responsible leader making tough decisions, rather than an incompetent manager eliminating threats to his authority. The most painful message came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, my thesis advisor at Arizona State University. Someone had forwarded her a news article about Streamline Apps' strategic technology initiatives, which mentioned the departure of senior engineering staff as part of the transition to modern development practices. Dr. Morrison's text was brief but pointed. "Saw the news about your company. Hope they understand what they're losing. Call me if you want to discuss opportunities in academia." That message made me realize how public my humiliation was becoming. The tech community in Austin was small and interconnected, with news traveling quickly through professional networks and social media. By tomorrow, everyone in the industry would know that I had been eliminated from Streamline Apps as part of their modernization effort. The story would become part of my professional reputation, a data point that future employers would consider when evaluating my candidacy. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through LinkedIn, watching as my former colleagues updated their profiles and shared company announcements about new projects and initiatives. Brad had posted a lengthy article about embracing change in fast-growing organizations, discussing the importance of staying current with technology trends and building teams that could scale effectively. The post received dozens of likes and supportive comments from his network, praising his leadership and vision for Streamline Apps' future. Reading Brad's corporate propaganda made my stomach turn. But it also clarified something important about the situation. This wasn't just a personnel decision, it was a public relations campaign designed to establish Brad's credibility as an innovative leader. My termination was being used as evidence of his willingness to make difficult decisions in service of technological progress. I was collateral damage in his personal branding exercise. The emotional weight of the day began hitting me in waves. Sitting alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to cry for the first time since leaving the office. The tears came from multiple sources: anger at the injustice of my situation, fear about my financial future, and grief for the loss of work that had defined my professional identity. But underneath those emotions was something deeper and more disturbing: a sense that my fundamental beliefs about merit and fairness had been shattered. I had grown up believing that hard work and exceptional results would be recognized and rewarded. My parents had sacrificed enormously to give me educational opportunities, and I had maximized those opportunities through determination and talent. The success of VaultCore had seemed to validate that worldview, proving that technical excellence could overcome systemic barriers in corporate politics. Brad's decision to eliminate me despite my proven contributions forced me to confront the possibility that I had been naive about how the world actually worked. My phone rang as darkness began falling over Austin. The caller ID showed Alex Martinez, my boyfriend of 2 years who taught high school mathematics and coached the debate team. Alex knew about the corporate tensions at Streamline Apps but hadn't expected anything as dramatic as my termination. His voice was gentle but concerned as he asked how I was processing the day's events. "I don't understand how they can just throw away 4 years of work," I told him, my voice still shaky from crying. VaultCore is the best fraud detection system in the industry. It's not opinion, it's measurable fact. But Brad acts like it's some kind of technical liability. Alex listened patiently as I explained the details of my termination meeting, the corporate doublespeak about modernization, and the crushing realization that my expertise was being treated as an obstacle rather than an asset. His perspective as an educator gave him insight into institutional politics and the ways that threatened administrators often eliminated talented subordinates who made them look incompetent by comparison. "This isn't about your technology," Alex said after I finished venting. "It's about Brad needing to prove that his leadership is making a difference. He can't take credit for VaultCore's success, because everyone knows you built it. But he can take credit for replacing it with something new, even if the new thing doesn't work as well." That analysis crystallized something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. Brad's modernization initiative wasn't driven by technical necessity. It was driven by ego and insecurity. He had inherited a successful company with profitable products, but he needed to demonstrate his value as a leader. Replacing functional systems with newer alternatives would give him concrete achievements to point to, regardless of whether those achievements actually improved the business. After talking with Alex, I opened a bottle of my favorite wine and began thinking more strategically about my situation. The initial shock and emotional pain were giving way to analytical clarity, and I started examining my termination from multiple angles. What had Brad accomplished by firing me? What vulnerabilities had he created? What advantages did I possess that he might not have considered? The first advantage was obvious. I understood PaySwift's technology infrastructure better than anyone currently employed at Streamline Apps. VaultCore was integrated deeply into the platform's payment processing pipeline, with dependencies and optimization techniques that weren't documented in any corporate repository. Brad's consultants could replace the system, but they would be working blind, without understanding the specific requirements that had shaped its original design. The second advantage was subtler but potentially more significant. I had maintained relationships throughout Austin's tech community that predated my employment at Streamline Apps. Former classmates from Arizona State worked at competing companies. Industry contacts knew about VaultCore's reputation, and technical leaders in other organizations had approached me over the years with job opportunities. Brad had eliminated me from Streamline Apps, but he couldn't eliminate me from the broader ecosystem. The third advantage was one that Brad probably didn't even know existed: VaultCore's intellectual property history. The core algorithms had originated in my master's thesis at Arizona State University, where I had retained certain rights to the academic work. Streamline Apps had licensed my implementation, but they had never formally acquired the underlying research that made VaultCore possible. That distinction might not matter in normal circumstances, but these circumstances were far from normal. I spent the evening researching intellectual property law and reviewing the documentation from my graduate work. The provisional patent that Arizona State had filed listed me as the primary inventor, with the university holding institutional rights to commercialize the technology. Streamline Apps had negotiated a licensing agreement when they hired me, but that agreement was specifically for my employment-based contributions, not for the foundational research that preceded my hiring. The more I studied the legal landscape, the more interesting my situation became. Brad had fired me for creating technology that was supposedly outdated and problematic, but if that technology was actually my intellectual property rather than Streamline Apps' corporate asset, then his replacement strategy might be more complicated than he realized. I couldn't use this information immediately. It would require careful legal analysis and strategic planning, but it was a thread worth pulling. By midnight, my emotional state had evolved from devastation to determination. Brad had humiliated me professionally and eliminated my source of income, but he had also made a critical error in judgment. He had treated me as a disposable employee rather than the creator of technology that his company depended on. That mistake would give me opportunities for response that he couldn't anticipate. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would begin a different phase of my career. I was no longer Maya Rodriguez, senior security architect at Streamline Apps. I was Maya Rodriguez, unemployed software developer with intimate knowledge of a $300 million payment processing system and potentially significant intellectual property claims. Brad had tried to write me out of PaySwift's story, but the story wasn't over yet. Part 4, The Hidden Ace. The next morning brought clarity that had been impossible during the emotional chaos of my termination. I woke early despite having nowhere to be. My mind immediately focused on questions that had crystallized overnight. The most important question wasn't what I would do next professionally, but what I actually owned legally. Brad had eliminated my position at Streamline Apps, but he hadn't eliminated the intellectual property rights that predated my employment there. I made coffee and opened my laptop, beginning a systematic review of documents I hadn't examined in years. The file cabinet in my home office contained relics from graduate school, research notes, draft papers, correspondence with professors, and most importantly, the complete development history of what would eventually become VaultCore. The algorithm hadn't emerged fully formed when I joined Streamline Apps. It had evolved over 18 months of academic research funded by National Science Foundation grants and university resources. The timeline was crucial to understanding my legal position. I had begun developing fraud detection algorithms in January of my second year at Arizona State, initially as part of a seminar on machine learning applications in financial services. The early versions were crude but promising, using basic pattern recognition to identify suspicious transaction behaviors. Professor Morrison had encouraged me to expand the research into a full thesis project, connecting me with industry partners who could provide real-world transaction data for testing. By September of that year, I had created a working prototype that exceeded existing commercial solutions in both accuracy and efficiency. The university's technology transfer office had taken notice, filing a provisional patent application that established my priority as the inventor, while protecting Arizona State's institutional interests. The patent filing was comprehensive, covering not just the specific algorithms I had developed, but the broader conceptual framework for adaptive fraud detection using machine learning techniques. Streamline Apps had recruited me during my final semester, offering a position that would allow me to commercialize my research within their existing payment processing infrastructure. The employment contract had included provisions for intellectual property, but those provisions were more complex than I had understood at the time. Streamline Apps would own any work I created using their resources or during company time, but my pre-existing research remained covered by the university patent. The licensing agreement between Arizona State and Streamline Apps was a separate document that I had signed as both the inventor and the new employee who would be implementing the technology. The agreement granted Streamline Apps exclusive commercial rights to use VaultCore within their products, but it didn't transfer ownership of the underlying intellectual property. Arizona State retained the patent rights. I remained listed as the primary inventor, and Streamline Apps paid ongoing royalties based on the revenue generated by systems incorporating my algorithms. Reading these documents 4 years later, I realized that everyone involved had made assumptions about how this arrangement would evolve. Arizona State had expected me to remain at Streamline Apps indefinitely, continuing to develop the technology within their licensed commercial application. Streamline Apps had treated VaultCore as a corporate asset that they controlled completely, apparently forgetting about the licensing arrangement that made their usage legitimate. I had focused on building the best possible product without considering the legal complexities of ownership and control. Brad's termination of my employment had disrupted all of these assumptions. If I was no longer a Streamline Apps employee, did their licensing agreement still provide protection for their use of VaultCore? The contract language was ambiguous on this point, referring to, quote, ongoing collaboration between the inventor and the licensee, without clearly defining what would happen if that collaboration ended involuntarily. I called Dr. Morrison at Arizona State to discuss the situation, reaching her during her afternoon office hours. Her reaction to my news was immediate and intense. "They fired you? Maya, that's insane. VaultCore is revolutionary technology, and you're the only person who truly understands how it works. What are they thinking?" "They're thinking they can replace it with something more conventional," I explained. "The new management considers my approach outdated and overly complex. They want industry-standard solutions that any developer can maintain." Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Maya, I need to ask you something important. Are they still planning to use VaultCore after your departure? Because if they are, we might have a problem with the licensing agreement." That was exactly the question I had been hoping she would raise. "They haven't announced plans to discontinue it," I said carefully. "In fact, they seem to be treating VaultCore as a corporate asset that will continue operating while they develop replacement systems. The transition could take months or even years." "That's very interesting," Dr. Morrison replied, and I could hear her shifting into the analytical mode that had made her such an effective research advisor. "The licensing agreement specifically requires ongoing collaboration between you and Streamline Apps. If they've terminated your employment, they may have violated the terms that allow them to use your technology." We spent an hour reviewing the legal documents and their potential interpretations. Dr. Morrison agreed to consult with Arizona State's Technology Transfer Office and the university's legal department to understand our options. The conversation revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated. The university had significant financial interests in protecting VaultCore's patent rights, since their royalty payments from Streamline Apps represented one of their most successful technology commercialization deals. After ending the call with Dr. Morrison, I began researching Streamline Apps' public statements about their technology modernization plans. Brad had been quoted in several industry publications discussing the company's evolution toward, quote, cloud-native, scalable solutions that would replace legacy systems developed during the company's earlier phases. While he never mentioned VaultCore specifically, the timeline and language made it clear that my fraud detection system was the primary target of his modernization efforts. More importantly, I found evidence that Streamline Apps was actively marketing VaultCore's capabilities to potential new customers. Their sales materials prominently featured fraud detection statistics that were only possible because of my algorithms, and their technical specifications promised security features that depended entirely on VaultCore's machine learning models. They were simultaneously planning to eliminate the technology and using it as a key selling point for new business. This contradiction revealed the fundamental flaw in Brad's strategy. He wanted to claim credit for modernizing Streamline Apps technology, while continuing to benefit from the superior performance that VaultCore provided. The replacement systems his consultants were developing wouldn't match VaultCore's capabilities for months or years, if ever. During that transition period, PaySwift would be vulnerable to both security breaches and competitive disadvantages. I spent the afternoon analyzing PaySwift's transaction patterns using monitoring tools that I had built but never formally transferred to Streamline Apps. These tools provided real-time visibility into VaultCore's performance, showing how the system adapted to new fraud patterns and optimized its responses based on transaction outcomes. The data revealed something that Brad's management team couldn't see. VaultCore was continuing to evolve and improve, even without my direct oversight. The monitoring data also showed something more concerning. Since my termination 2 days earlier, VaultCore had begun generating error logs that suggested the system was encountering edge cases that required manual intervention. These weren't critical failures that would crash the platform, but they were warning signs that the algorithm was dealing with fraud patterns it hadn't seen before. Without someone who understood the system's learning processes, these warnings might go unnoticed until they escalated into actual security breaches. I realized that I had an opportunity to document these emerging issues before they became critical problems. If Vault Core failed catastrophically while I was unemployed, Streamline Apps could claim that the system was inherently unstable rather than acknowledging that it required expert maintenance. But if I could demonstrate that the system was encountering predictable issues that could be easily resolved with proper expertise, it would strengthen my position in any future negotiations. That evening, I began preparing a comprehensive analysis of Vault Core's intellectual property status, technical dependencies, and operational requirements. The document would serve multiple purposes, helping Dr. Morrison understand the legal complexities, providing evidence for potential licensing disputes, and demonstrating to anyone who would listen that Brad had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The analysis revealed the scope of Streamline Apps' dependence on my work. Vault Core wasn't just a fraud detection module that could be swapped out for alternatives. It was integrated into every aspect of PaySwift's payment processing pipeline. The system validated transactions, assessed risk levels, updated security parameters, and generated the performance metrics that Streamline Apps used for everything from customer support to investor presentations. Replacing Vault Core would require rebuilding substantial portions of PaySwift's core infrastructure, not just implementing a new fraud detection algorithm. The consulting firm that Brad had hired might understand machine learning in the abstract, but they had no experience with the specific requirements of real-time payment processing at PaySwift's scale. Their cookie-cutter solution would need to be extensively customized, tested, and optimized before it could handle the complexity of actual transaction flows. More importantly, my analysis confirmed that Streamline Apps had never developed independent expertise in fraud detection technology. The engineering team included talented developers who could implement features and fix bugs, but none of them had the deep understanding of machine learning and payment security that Vault Core required. They had relied entirely on my knowledge and judgment for 4 years, treating me as the single source of truth for anything related to fraud prevention. Brad had fired the one person who could ensure PaySwift's continued security and competitiveness, apparently believing that the technology could operate independently of its creator. That assumption would be tested very soon, as Vault Core encountered fraud patterns that required human insight to address effectively. When those tests failed, Streamline Apps would face a choice between admitting their mistake and suffering the consequences of degraded security. I closed my laptop and poured another glass of wine, feeling something I hadn't experienced since my termination: anticipation. Brad had given me an unexpected gift by firing me so abruptly and carelessly. He had created a situation where I held significant leverage over a company that depended entirely on technology I had created and still legally controlled. The question was no longer whether I could recover from this setback, but how I wanted to use the advantages he had inadvertently provided. The next phase of this story would depend on choices that Brad was about to make. If he handled the transition professionally and acknowledged the complexities involved, we might be able to reach an amicable resolution that protected both Streamline Apps' business interests and my intellectual property rights. But if he continued treating my contributions as dispensable legacy code, he would discover that some legacies are more powerful than their creators initially realize. Part 5. The intelligence gathering Jessica Chen's text message arrived at 7 in the morning, 3 days after my termination. Coffee today? I have information you need to see. We arranged to meet at Cafe Momentum on South Lamar, a quiet spot far enough from the Streamline Apps office to avoid accidental encounters with former colleagues. Jessica was one of the few people at the company I trusted completely. A brilliant junior developer who had joined my team 8 months earlier and quickly demonstrated both technical talent and ethical integrity that reminded me of myself at her age. I arrived early and claimed a corner table where we could speak privately. Jessica appeared 15 minutes later, looking nervous and carrying a laptop bag that seemed heavier than usual. She ordered her coffee and sat across from me, glancing around the cafe before pulling out her phone and opening what appeared to be a secure messaging application. "Maya, I need you to know that what I'm about to show you could get me fired," she said quietly. But what's happening at the company is wrong, and you deserve to understand the full situation. She turned her phone toward me, displaying screenshots of internal Slack conversations between Brad Thompson and his inner circle of recently hired developers. The messages had been captured over the past 3 days, documenting their discussions about my termination and their plans for replacing VaultCore. Reading them felt like eavesdropping on a conversation designed to diminish and dismiss everything I had accomplished. The first screenshot showed Brad responding to a question about the timeline for implementing the new fraud detection system. His message was blunt. Maya's departure actually simplifies things. We don't have to waste time getting buy-in from someone who's emotionally attached to outdated approaches. The consulting team can move faster without having to justify every decision to the previous architect. Derek Chen, one of Brad's Silicon Valley imports, had replied with equal dismissiveness. Honestly, looking at this VaultCore codebase, I'm amazed it works at all. It's like someone tried to reinvent machine learning instead of using established frameworks. Classic NIH syndrome from someone who doesn't understand industry best practices. NIH syndrome, not invented here, was a pejorative term used to describe developers who rejected existing solutions in favor of building everything from scratch. The accusation stung because it completely misrepresented why I had created custom algorithms for VaultCore. I hadn't rejected industry-standard approaches out of arrogance. I had surpassed them because standard approaches weren't good enough for PaySwift's requirements. The conversation continued with technical critiques that revealed how little Brad's team understood about fraud detection requirements. They complained about VaultCore's unnecessary complexity without recognizing that the complexity was purposeful, designed to handle edge cases and adversarial attacks that simpler systems couldn't address. They criticized the custom machine learning models without understanding that those models had been trained on PaySwift's specific transaction patterns and user behaviors. Most damaging was a message from Brad himself. The good news is that Maya built this thing to be incomprehensible to anyone else. When the new system works better and costs less to maintain, it'll be obvious that we made the right call. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions to move forward. Jessica scrolled to the next screenshot showing a conversation about communicating my termination to the rest of the engineering team. Brad had instructed his managers to frame the departure as part of a broader reorganization, emphasizing the company's commitment to modernization, rather than acknowledging any individual contributions. The goal was to minimize questions about why someone with my track record had been eliminated. They're telling everyone that you were resistant to change, Jessica explained, her voice tight with anger. Brad had a team meeting yesterday where he said that some people get too attached to their own solutions and can't see the bigger picture. He made it sound like you were holding the company back. That narrative inversion was particularly galling. I had been the one pushing for continuous improvement and evolution of PaySwift's security capabilities. My quarterly reports had consistently identified areas for enhancement and proposed new features that would strengthen fraud detection. Brad had eliminated the person most committed to advancing the technology, while claiming that person was resistant to progress. The screenshots continued, revealing discussions about the consulting firm that would replace VaultCore. The company, called SecureFlow Systems, specialized in implementing, quote, turnkey fraud prevention solutions for mid-sized financial technology companies. Their approach was exactly what I had expected. A standardized platform that promised adequate security through conventional machine learning techniques and industry-standard algorithms. Brad's messages about SecureFlow revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what made VaultCore effective. He was excited about their proven track record and scalable architecture, but he showed no awareness that proven and scalable often meant mediocre and generic. SecureFlow's solutions worked adequately for companies with average security requirements, but PaySwift processed $300 million monthly, with users who expected seamless transactions and bulletproof protection. More concerning were the timeline discussions. SecureFlow had estimated that implementing their platform would require 4 to 6 months of development work, during which PaySwift would continue relying on VaultCore for fraud detection. Brad seemed to believe that the transition would be straightforward, involving little more than swapping one system for another. The reality would be far more complex, requiring extensive testing, data migration, and integration work that could easily extend the timeline by months or years. Jessica showed me the final screenshot, a message that made my blood run cold. Derek had asked about potential intellectual property issues with Vault Core, noting that some of the algorithms seemed unusually sophisticated for internal development. Brad's response was dismissive. Maya was hired to build fraud detection systems. Whatever she created belongs to the company. IP lawyers confirmed we're covered. That message revealed either stunning incompetence or willful ignorance about Vault Core's legal status. Brad's IP lawyers had apparently reviewed standard employment contracts without understanding the complex licensing arrangement with Arizona State University. They had assumed that hiring me had automatically transferred all rights to my previous research, not realizing that the university patent remained in effect and that my termination might invalidate Streamline Apps' licensing agreement. There's more, Jessica said, closing the screenshot application and opening her laptop. I've been monitoring Vault Core's performance since you left, and there are problems starting to develop. She showed me error logs and performance metrics that revealed exactly what I had feared. Vault Core was encountering fraud patterns that required manual intervention, generating warning alerts that were being ignored or misunderstood by the remaining engineering team. The system was still functional, but it was beginning to degrade in ways that would compound over time without expert oversight. The most serious issue involved international transaction processing. Vault Core had learned to recognize legitimate payment patterns from users traveling abroad, distinguishing them from actually fraudulent international charges. But new fraud techniques were emerging that mimicked legitimate travel spending, and the system needed human guidance to update its algorithms accordingly. Without that guidance, Vault Core would either flag legitimate transactions as suspicious or allow actual fraud to pass undetected. Either outcome would damage PaySwift's reputation and cost Streamline Apps significant money. Jessica pulled up a dashboard that showed Vault Core's detection rates over the past week. The numbers told a troubling story. False positives had increased by 12%, while the system had missed several confirmed fraudulent transactions that should have been obvious red flags. The degradation wasn't dramatic enough to trigger immediate panic, but it represented the beginning of a dangerous trend that would accelerate without intervention. The team is starting to notice, Jessica explained, scrolling through internal chat logs that discussed the anomalous results. But nobody understands what's causing the problems or how to fix them. Derek keeps saying the issues will resolve themselves once we implement the new system, but that's months away. I studied the data with growing alarm and vindication. Vault Core's decline was following exactly the pattern I had predicted when Brad announced his modernization plans. The system wasn't failing catastrophically. It was slowly losing its edge as new fraud techniques emerged, and the algorithms fell behind without proper guidance. By the time the degradation became obvious to management, the damage to PaySwift's security would be substantial and potentially irreversible. Are they documenting these issues? I asked, already knowing the answer but hoping I was wrong. Jessica shook her head. Derek told everyone to focus on the transition planning rather than spending time debugging the old system. He said troubleshooting Vault Core was a waste of engineering resources since they're replacing it anyway. That decision revealed the depth of Brad's miscalculation. He was allowing PaySwift's security to deteriorate while his team focused on implementing an inferior replacement system. When the new fraud detection platform inevitably failed to match Vault Core's performance, he would blame the problems on inherent flaws in my original design rather than acknowledging his own management failures. Jessica closed her laptop and leaned forward, her expression serious. Maya, there's something else you need to know. I've been in touch with Marcus Johnson at TechFlow Solutions. They've been trying to poach Streamline Apps developers for months, and they're very interested in talking to you. TechFlow Solutions was one of PaySwift's primary competitors, a San Francisco-based company that had been steadily gaining market share in the enterprise payment processing space. Their technology was solid but conventional, lacking the innovative features that had made PaySwift dominant in the consumer market. Marcus Johnson was their chief technology officer, a respected engineer who had been trying to expand TechFlow's capabilities beyond basic transaction processing. Marcus reached out to me yesterday, Jessica continued. He heard about your departure through industry channels and wanted to know if you might be interested in consulting opportunities. I didn't commit to anything, but I said I would pass along the message. The timing was intriguing. TechFlow had been looking for ways to compete more effectively against PaySwift's superior fraud detection capabilities, and my sudden availability represented an unexpected opportunity. If I were to work with them on implementing advanced security features, it could shift the competitive landscape significantly. PaySwift's main technological advantage was built on Vault Core's performance, and that advantage was already beginning to erode. What kind of consulting are they considering? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Marcus was careful not to say anything specific over the phone, Jessica replied. But reading between the lines, I think they want to understand how PaySwift achieved such good fraud detection results. They've been trying to reverse engineer your algorithms for years without success. That made perfect sense from TechFlow's perspective. They had access to industry-standard fraud detection solutions, but those solutions couldn't match Vault Core's sophisticated machine learning models and adaptive algorithms. If they could develop comparable technology, they could offer their customers security features that rivaled or exceeded PaySwift's capabilities. More importantly, TechFlow had something that Streamline Apps was about to lose: respect for technical expertise and willingness to invest in advanced development work. Marcus Johnson had built his reputation by hiring exceptional engineers and giving them the resources needed to create innovative solutions. His company culture valued depth of knowledge over corporate buzzwords, exactly the opposite of Brad's management philosophy. I exchanged contact information with Jessica and promised to stay in touch as the situation at Streamline Apps continued evolving. She was taking significant risks by sharing confidential information with me, but she believed that the company's direction was fundamentally wrong and that someone needed to document what was really happening. If Vault Core's degradation led to security breaches or customer losses, there should be a record showing that the problems were predictable and preventable. Walking back to my car after our coffee meeting, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced since my termination. The intelligence Jessica had provided confirmed my analysis of Brad's mistakes while revealing opportunities I hadn't considered. Streamline Apps was vulnerable in ways that went beyond simple technical dependencies, and their competitors were already positioning themselves to capitalize on those vulnerabilities. That afternoon, I called Marcus Johnson from my apartment, introducing myself and explaining my current situation in general terms. Marcus was diplomatic, but clearly excited about the possibility of working together. TechFlow had been watching PaySwift's success with admiration and frustration, recognizing that their competitor had achieved something special but unable to replicate it with their existing team and resources. Maya, I've been following your work for years, Marcus said during our initial conversation. Vault Core is legendary in the fraud detection community. Everyone knows PaySwift has the best security in the industry, and everyone knows you're the reason why. When I heard about your departure, I couldn't believe Streamline Apps would make such an obvious mistake. His assessment was gratifying but also strategic. Marcus understood that I represented an opportunity to leapfrog PaySwift's technological advantages, while their internal chaos created temporary weaknesses. If TechFlow could develop superior fraud detection capabilities while PaySwift struggled with their transition, the competitive dynamics of the entire industry could shift dramatically. What kind of timeline are you considering? I asked, curious about how quickly TechFlow could move if we decided to work together. That depends on your availability and interest level, Marcus replied. We could start with a consulting arrangement to assess the feasibility of enhancing our existing security platform. If the initial work goes well, we'd be very interested in discussing more substantial collaboration. The carefully neutral language couldn't hide the implications. TechFlow wanted to understand Vault Core's capabilities well enough to develop competitive alternatives, and they were willing to pay significantly for that knowledge. If I could help them create fraud detection technology that matched or exceeded PaySwift's performance, Streamline Apps would lose their primary competitive advantage, just as their internal system was beginning to fail. I agreed to consider Marcus's proposal while conducting my own due diligence on TechFlow's technical capabilities and business objectives. Any consulting arrangement would need to comply with the non-compete restrictions in my Streamline Apps termination agreement, but those restrictions were narrowly defined and focused on direct employment rather than consulting relationships. More importantly, I needed to understand the intellectual property implications of working with TechFlow. If VaultCore's algorithms were indeed covered by Arizona State University's patent, then my knowledge of those algorithms might be valuable independent of any specific commercial implementation. I could potentially help TechFlow develop fraud detection technology that used similar principles without directly copying proprietary code. That evening, I spent several hours researching TechFlow's existing technology platform and recent development initiatives. Their payment processing infrastructure was well-designed but conventional, built around industry-standard frameworks and established best practices. Their fraud detection capabilities were adequate for basic security requirements but lacked the sophistication needed to handle advanced attacks or optimize user experience. Most interesting was TechFlow's recent hiring pattern. They had been recruiting machine learning specialists and security experts from major technology companies, apparently preparing for a significant investment in advanced fraud prevention capabilities. My potential involvement would accelerate those efforts dramatically, providing both technical expertise and strategic insight into what made superior fraud detection possible. The competitive implications were substantial. If TechFlow could rapidly deploy fraud detection technology that matched VaultCore's performance, PaySwift's customers would have access to equivalent security from multiple vendors. That competition would force both companies to innovate more aggressively, ultimately benefiting the entire payment processing ecosystem. But in the short term, it would destroy Streamline App's most valuable differentiator, just as they were voluntarily weakening their own capabilities. I also researched SecureFlow Systems, the consulting firm that Brad had hired to replace VaultCore. Their marketing materials promised, quote, enterprise-grade fraud prevention solutions and seamless integration with existing payment platforms. But their case studies revealed a pattern of mediocre results and extended implementation timelines. Their typical customer was a mid-sized company with modest security requirements, not a high-volume platform like PaySwift that needed to process millions of transactions daily. SecureFlow's standard approach involved deploying pre-configured machine learning models that had been trained on generic transaction data from multiple clients. These models provided reasonable protection against common fraud techniques, but they lacked the specialization needed to handle PaySwift's specific user patterns and threat environment. The implementation would likely reduce false positives compared to completely rule-based systems, but it would also miss sophisticated attacks that VaultCore could identify and prevent. More concerning was SecureFlow's track record with complex integrations. Their case studies showed multiple projects that had exceeded original timelines by 6 months or more, often requiring extensive customization work that negated the supposed advantages of their standardized platform. Brad was expecting a 4 to 6 month transition, but the reality would more likely be 12 to 18 months of difficult integration work. By the end of the week, I had developed a comprehensive understanding of the forces in motion around PaySwift's fraud detection transition. Streamline Apps was voluntarily degrading their competitive advantages, while their primary competitor prepared to surpass them technologically. The consulting firm hired to manage the transition had a poor track record with similar projects, and the executive driving these decisions had no technical background to recognize the problems developing around him. The situation represented an almost perfect storm of corporate mismanagement, technological hubris, and competitive opportunity. Brad had created conditions that would allow me to transform my termination from a career setback into a strategic advantage. If I played my cards correctly, I could simultaneously damage Streamline Apps' business prospects and enhance my own professional position within the industry. The question was no longer whether I wanted revenge against Brad and his management team. The question was how much damage I was willing to inflict in pursuit of that revenge, and whether I could achieve my goals while maintaining my own ethical standards and professional reputation. The tools for Brad's destruction were falling into my hands, but using them would require careful planning and precise execution. I spent that weekend developing a comprehensive strategy that would protect my interests while exposing the flaws in Brad's modernization initiative. The plan involved multiple phases, each designed to increase pressure on Streamline Apps while building my own leverage within the industry. If everything worked correctly, Brad would discover that firing me had been the most expensive mistake of his professional career. The first phase would involve documenting VaultCore's intellectual property status and establishing my legal rights to the underlying technology. Dr. Morrison had already begun consulting with Arizona State's legal team, and their preliminary analysis suggested that Streamline App's licensing agreement might not survive my involuntary termination. If that analysis proved correct, continued use of VaultCore could constitute patent infringement. The second phase would involve consulting with TechFlow Solutions to develop competitive alternatives to PaySwift's fraud detection capabilities. This work would need to be carefully structured to avoid violating my non-compete agreement while still providing valuable technical insights. If successful, it would eliminate Streamline App's primary competitive advantage while establishing my reputation as the industry's leading expert in payment security. The third phase would involve strategic communication with industry publications and professional networks to ensure that Brad's mismanagement became widely known within the technology community. This wouldn't require any violations of confidentiality agreements, since the information would come from public sources and general technical analysis rather than internal corporate data. The final phase would depend on how Streamline Apps responded to the mounting pressures. If Brad acknowledged his mistakes and attempted to negotiate a resolution, I might be willing to consider terms that protected both parties' interests. But if he continued treating my contributions as disposable and my expertise as worthless, I would be prepared to demonstrate just how wrong those assumptions were. I closed my planning documents and poured a glass of wine, feeling more confident about my future than I had since walking out of Streamline App's headquarters. Brad had intended to eliminate a troublesome employee who didn't fit his vision for the company's evolution. Instead, he had created a motivated adversary with intimate knowledge of his company's vulnerabilities and access to resources that could exploit those vulnerabilities effectively. The war Brad had started by firing me was about to enter a new phase, one where his advantages in corporate authority and financial resources would matter less than technical competence and strategic thinking. I had spent 4 years building technology that revolutionized fraud detection, and I was about to demonstrate that the creator of that technology was far more dangerous as an enemy than as an employee. The next few months would test everything I had learned about business strategy, technical innovation, and corporate politics. But for the first time since my termination, I felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Brad had taught me an important lesson about the realities of corporate life, and I was prepared to return the favor by teaching him about the consequences of underestimating technical talent. 3 months after my termination, I sat in TechFlow Solutions' gleaming San Francisco headquarters, watching PaySwift's catastrophic failure unfold in real time. The wall-mounted monitors displayed transaction data, fraud detection rates, and customer satisfaction metrics that painted a devastating picture of Streamline App's decline. VaultCore had finally collapsed under the weight of accumulated errors and neglect, taking PaySwift's reputation with it. The system that Brad Thompson had dismissed as outdated legacy code was now causing millions in losses while generating headlines that would haunt his career forever. The collapse began exactly as I had predicted. VaultCore's machine learning algorithms had been encountering increasingly sophisticated fraud patterns that required human intervention to address effectively. Without my oversight, the system started flagging legitimate transactions as suspicious while allowing actual fraudulent charges to process undetected. The error rates climbed gradually at first, then accelerated as the algorithms made increasingly poor decisions based on incomplete training data. Marcus Johnson, TechFlow's CTO, had been monitoring PaySwift's declining performance through industry reports and customer feedback channels. The data showed a company in crisis, hemorrhaging clients who were frustrated with false payment rejections and security breaches that VaultCore should have prevented. Streamline App's stock price had dropped 37% since my firing, with financial analysts specifically citing, quote, deteriorating payment security capabilities as a primary concern. "Maya, this is remarkable," Marcus said, scrolling through the latest customer satisfaction surveys from PaySwift users. Their fraud detection accuracy has fallen to levels that were considered unacceptable 5 years ago. How did they manage to destroy such an advanced system so quickly? The answer was simple but devastating. Brad had eliminated the only person who understood how VaultCore actually worked, while assuming that the technology could maintain itself indefinitely. His replacement team from SecureFlow Systems had spent 3 months trying to implement their generic fraud detection platform, but they had discovered that integrating with PaySwift's existing infrastructure was far more complex than their initial assessment had suggested. The project was already 6 months behind schedule, with no clear completion date in sight. Meanwhile, I had been working with TechFlow to develop what we called Guardian Protocol, a next-generation fraud detection system that incorporated all of VaultCore's innovations while adding new capabilities that I had always wanted to implement. The system used advanced neural networks to analyze transaction patterns in real time, adapting to new fraud techniques within hours rather than weeks. More importantly, Guardian Protocol was designed from the ground up to be maintainable and extensible, with comprehensive documentation and monitoring tools that would prevent the kind of degradation that had destroyed VaultCore. The legal situation had evolved exactly as Dr. Morrison and I had hoped. Arizona State University's Technology Transfer Office had conducted a thorough review of the licensing agreement with Streamline Apps and concluded that my termination had indeed violated the terms that allowed them to use VaultCore. The university had sent a formal cease and desist letter demanding that Streamline Apps stop using any technology covered by my patents, including all of the core algorithms that made PaySwift's fraud detection possible. Brad's response to the legal challenge had been characteristically arrogant and poorly informed. Streamline Apps lawyers had argued that my employment contract transferred all intellectual property rights to the company, ignoring the prior patent held by Arizona State. When that argument failed, they claimed that VaultCore had been so substantially modified during my employment that it no longer resembled the original university research. That claim fell apart when expert analysis revealed that the core algorithms remained essentially unchanged from my thesis work. The intellectual property dispute had created a perfect storm for Streamline Apps. They couldn't continue using VaultCore without risking a massive patent infringement lawsuit, but they also couldn't replace it quickly enough to avoid serious business disruption. Brad had gambled everything on SecureFlow's ability to deliver a working alternative within 6 months, and that gamble was failing spectacularly as technical challenges mounted and deadlines slipped. Dr. Morrison had kept me informed about the university's legal strategy throughout the process. Arizona State was seeking not just an injunction against further use of VaultCore, but also substantial financial damages for the years of unauthorized usage. The university's calculations suggested that Streamline Apps owed millions in back royalties and penalty payments, amounts that would seriously damage the company's financial position even if they could resolve the technical problems. The irony is beautiful. Drive, Morrison had told me during our most recent conversation. They fired you to eliminate what they considered technical debt, but now they're facing actual financial debt that could bankrupt the company. Brad Thompson has managed to transform their greatest asset into their biggest liability. The competitive implications were playing out exactly as Marcus and I had envisioned. TechFlow's Guardian Protocol had been in development for only 3 months, but it was already demonstrating superior performance to any existing fraud detection system in the market. Our testing showed accuracy rates that exceeded VaultCore's peak performance, while maintaining the low false positive rates that users demanded. More importantly, Guardian Protocol included features that VaultCore had never offered, such as real-time risk scoring for individual merchants and predictive analytics that could identify emerging fraud trends before they became widespread. TechFlow had announced Guardian Protocol's development through a carefully orchestrated media campaign that highlighted both the technical innovations and the story behind its creation. Industry publications were fascinated by the narrative of a brilliant engineer who had been fired for creating technology that was supposedly outdated, only to develop an even more advanced system for a competitor. The coverage had made me something of a celebrity within the fintech community, while generating enormous interest in TechFlow's upcoming product launch. The media attention had been particularly brutal for Brad Thompson and Streamline Apps. TechCrunch had published a devastating analysis titled, "How Bad Management Destroyed a $300 million Company," detailing the sequence of decisions that had led to PaySwift's collapse. The article quoted anonymous sources within Streamline Apps describing Brad as an incompetent executive who had eliminated key talent while pursuing buzzword-driven modernization initiatives that had no basis in technical reality. Forbes had followed with an even more damaging piece called "The Most Expensive Firing in Tech History," calculating that Brad's decision to terminate me had cost Streamline Apps approximately $200 million in lost revenue, legal expenses, and competitive disadvantage. The article interviewed several industry experts who described VaultCore as revolutionary technology, and my firing as one of the most short-sighted management decisions in Silicon Valley history. Wall Street Journal's coverage had focused on the broader implications for corporate governance and technical leadership in the technology industry. Their analysis suggested that Streamline Apps represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of promoting business executives to technical leadership roles without ensuring they understood the technologies they were managing. The article quoted several venture capitalists who said they would be more careful about investing in companies where non-technical executives had authority over critical technical decisions. The personal vindication was satisfying, but the professional opportunities were even more exciting. TechFlow had offered me a position as Chief Security Officer with equity compensation that would make me financially independent within 5 years. The role would give me authority over all aspects of payment security across TechFlow's entire platform, with resources to hire a world-class team and develop innovations that would define the industry's future. More importantly, I had received inquiries from venture capital firms interested in funding independent companies built around my expertise in fraud detection and payment security. Several prominent investors had suggested that the market was ready for a specialized security platform that could serve multiple payment processors, rather than being tied to any single company's infrastructure. The concept was intriguing, and the financial projections were extraordinary. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the response from other women in technology who had followed my story through industry publications and social media. Dozens of female engineers had reached out to share their own experiences with workplace discrimination and technical contributions that had been minimized or stolen by male colleagues. Many of them expressed gratitude for my willingness to fight back publicly, rather than accepting the injustice quietly. Several of these women had formed an informal network, focused on supporting each other's career advancement and protecting intellectual property rights. We had begun meeting monthly in Austin to discuss technical challenges, share job opportunities, and develop strategies for navigating corporate politics without compromising our values. The group had grown to include over 50 members across multiple companies, creating a support system that none of us had access to earlier in our careers. The network had already proven its value when one member faced a situation similar to mine at a different Austin tech company. Her employer had attempted to claim ownership of algorithms she had developed during graduate school, using the same legal arguments that Brad had tried with VaultCore. But unlike my situation, she had the support of an experienced group who could help her understand her rights and connect her with appropriate legal representation. The case was resolved quickly and favorably, establishing precedent that would protect other women facing similar challenges. Dr. Morrison had suggested that we formalize the network into a nonprofit organization focused on protecting intellectual property rights for underrepresented groups in technology. The organization could provide legal resources, technical expertise, and professional support for engineers whose contributions were being minimized or stolen. We were exploring partnerships with law schools and technology companies that could provide funding and expertise for this initiative. Meanwhile, Streamline Apps continued its spectacular decline. The company had missed 3 consecutive quarterly earnings projections, with revenue falling as customers abandoned PaySwift for more reliable alternatives. Brad had been forced to lay off nearly 30% of the engineering team to reduce costs, further hampering their ability to address the technical problems that were driving customers away. Jessica Chen had finally left Streamline Apps after watching the company deteriorate for months. She joined TechFlow as a senior developer on the Guardian Protocol team, bringing insider knowledge about PaySwift's architecture that helped us understand how to position our technology most effectively. Her departure was part of a broader exodus of talent from Streamline Apps, as experienced engineers recognized that the company's technical foundation was collapsing. "Maya, I need to tell you something," Jessica had said during her first week at TechFlow. "Brad is trying to hire you back. He's desperate enough to offer almost anything, including public acknowledgement that firing you was a mistake." The irony was perfect. Brad Thompson, who had dismissed my expertise as outdated and incompatible with modern development practices, was now begging for my help to save the company he had nearly destroyed. But his offer came too late. I had already committed to TechFlow, and was building something far more exciting than anything Streamline Apps could offer. Marcus had shared Brad's increasingly frantic attempts to poach TechFlow employees who might understand Guardian Protocol's capabilities. Streamline Apps was offering signing bonuses and salary increases that far exceeded industry standards, but they weren't finding any takers. Word had spread throughout the Austin tech community that Streamline Apps was a sinking ship with incompetent leadership and fundamental technical problems that might be impossible to solve. The final blow came when PaySwift suffered a major security breach that VaultCore should have prevented easily. Fraudsters had exploited weaknesses in the replacement system to steal over $2 million from customer accounts before the attack was detected and stopped. The breach generated national news coverage and regulatory scrutiny that would haunt Streamline Apps for years to come. The Federal Trade Commission announced an investigation into Streamline Apps' security practices, focusing specifically on the circumstances surrounding VaultCore's replacement and the company's failure to maintain adequate fraud protection. Early reports suggested that the FTC was considering substantial fines and oversight requirements that would further damage the company's competitive position. Customer lawsuits began flooding in within days of the breach announcement. Affected users were demanding compensation for stolen funds, but they were also seeking punitive damages based on claims that Streamline Apps had knowingly weakened their security system by eliminating the person responsible for its development. Several law firms had announced class action suits that could cost the company hundreds of millions in settlements and legal fees. Streamline Apps' board of directors finally acted decisively, announcing Brad Thompson's immediate termination as VP of Engineering, along with several of his key hires. The press release diplomatically cited strategic differences regarding technology development priorities. But industry insiders understood that Brad had been fired for gross incompetence that had nearly destroyed the company. The board named Harold Chen, our former CTO, as interim head of engineering, with a mandate to assess the damage and develop a recovery plan. Harold's first action was to halt the SecureFlow implementation and begin evaluating options for rebuilding PaySwift's fraud detection capabilities from scratch. His second action was to reach out to me through back channels, hoping to understand whether any kind of reconciliation might be possible. Harold's approach was respectful and acknowledgement of the mistakes that had been made under Brad's leadership. He recognized that I had been treated unfairly and that my termination had been based on political rather than technical considerations. But he also understood that the damage was probably irreversible, given the legal disputes and competitive dynamics that had emerged since my departure. "Maya, I know we can't undo what happened," Harold said during our phone conversation. "But I want you to know that not everyone at Streamline Apps supported Brad's decisions. Many of us recognized your value and tried to protect your position. But we failed. I'm sorry for that." His apology was genuine and appreciated, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality that Streamline Apps was no longer a viable competitor in the payment processing market. Even if they could resolve the legal issues around VaultCore, the company lacked the technical expertise and financial resources needed to rebuild their fraud detection capabilities. The market had moved on, and TechFlow's Guardian Protocol was about to establish new standards that would be difficult for anyone to match. I spent the afternoon reviewing TechFlow's quarterly business results, which showed accelerating growth, driven largely by customers switching from PaySwift and other platforms that couldn't match Guardian Protocol's security capabilities. The system was processing over $500 million in transactions monthly, with fraud rates that were barely measurable and false positive rates that had essentially been eliminated. Customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, and retention rates exceeded 95%. More exciting were the expansion opportunities that Guardian Protocol's success had created. TechFlow was fielding inquiries from major retailers, healthcare companies, and government agencies that wanted to implement our fraud detection technology in their own payment systems. The licensing revenue potential was enormous, representing a market opportunity that could transform TechFlow from a regional player into a global leader in payment security. My equity position in TechFlow had already become worth more than I had earned during my entire career at Streamline Apps. If the company continued growing at its current rate, the financial returns would exceed my most optimistic projections from just 6 months earlier. But more importantly, I was building technology that would define the industry's future, while working with people who understood and appreciated my contributions. That evening, I received a text message from my mother in Mesa, congratulating me on a profile that had appeared in Arizona Republic highlighting my success with TechFlow. The article had described me as, quote, one of Arizona's most influential technology leaders, and had included a photo of me standing in front of the TechFlow headquarters with San Francisco's skyline in the background. Mija, your father and I are so proud, the message read. You showed them that nobody can stop our Maya when she puts her mind to something. Corazón restaurant is doing much better now with the new payment system you helped us set up. That reference to the restaurant's payment system reminded me of one of Guardian Protocol's most personally satisfying features. TechFlow had developed a small business package that provided enterprise-level fraud protection at affordable rates for companies like my parents' restaurant. The system had virtually eliminated the processing fees and false rejections that had plagued small merchants for decades, allowing them to compete more effectively with larger businesses that had previously enjoyed significant advantages. The small business initiative had become one of Guardian Protocol's most successful market segments, generating both revenue and positive publicity that strengthened TechFlow's reputation within the technology community. Industry analysts were describing it as a democratization of payment security that could transform how small businesses interacted with the digital economy. I closed my laptop and walked out onto TechFlow's rooftop terrace, looking out over San Francisco Bay as the sun set behind the Golden Gate Bridge. 6 months earlier, I had been a fired employee carrying my belongings in a cardboard box, humiliated by a manager who didn't understand the value of what I had created. Tonight, I was the chief security officer of one of the fastest-growing companies in fintech, with technology that was revolutionizing an entire industry. Brad Thompson's attempt to eliminate me from Streamline Apps had backfired in ways that exceeded my most vindictive fantasies. He had not only destroyed his own company and career, but he had also created the conditions for my greatest professional triumph. The outdated engineer he had dismissed was now leading the development of fraud detection technology that would define industry standards for the next decade. The lesson was simple but powerful. Technical competence and innovation will always triumph over corporate politics and management buzzwords. Brad had confused authority with expertise, believing that his position gave him the right to make technical decisions without understanding their implications. That mistake had cost him everything, while providing me with opportunities I had never imagined possible. As I watched the lights begin to twinkle across the bay, I thought about all the other brilliant engineers who had been underestimated, dismissed, or eliminated by incompetent managers who felt threatened by superior technical knowledge. My story had become a rallying cry for those people, proof that talent and determination could overcome even the most unfair circumstances. The future was full of possibilities that would have been impossible to imagine during my darkest moments after the termination. Guardian Protocol was just the beginning of what I could accomplish with the right resources and support. TechFlow was committed to pushing the boundaries of what fraud detection technology could achieve, and I had the freedom to pursue innovations that would benefit millions of users around the world. Brad Thompson had taught me an important lesson about the realities of corporate life, but I had taught him an even more important lesson about the consequences of underestimating technical talent. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his company was facing potential bankruptcy, because he had made the mistake of firing someone whose expertise he couldn't understand or replicate. The war he had started by dismissing my contributions as outdated had ended with my complete victory and his total defeat. Justice had been served in the most satisfying way possible, through the marketplace, where superior technology and authentic innovation always prevail over incompetent management and empty corporate rhetoric. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as Guardian Protocol continued expanding into new markets and applications. But tonight I was content to celebrate the transformation from fired employee to industry leader, from underestimated engineer to recognized innovator. Brad Thompson's biggest mistake had become my greatest opportunity, and I was just getting started. 1 year later, I stood on the stage at the Global FinTech Innovation Summit in Denver, looking out at an audience of 3,000 industry leaders, engineers, and entrepreneurs who had gathered to hear about the future of payment security. The keynote address I was about to deliver would be broadcast live to over 50,000 viewers worldwide, cementing my reputation as the foremost authority on fraud detection technology. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brad Thompson had been scheduled to speak at this same conference the previous year, back when he still believed that eliminating me would enhance his credibility as a visionary leader. The conference organizers had introduced me as the architect of the most significant advancement in payment security in the past decade, referring to Guardian Protocol's revolutionary impact on the industry. What they didn't mention was that this same technology had been dismissed as outdated legacy code by a manager who couldn't distinguish between innovation and antiquation. The journey from terminated employee to keynote speaker had been remarkable, but the most satisfying part was knowing that my success was built on the very expertise that Brad had tried to eliminate. Guardian Protocol had exceeded every projection we had made during its development phase. TechFlow was now processing over $2 billion in transactions monthly across 15 countries, with fraud rates so low that they were considered statistically insignificant. The system had prevented an estimated $40 million in fraudulent charges during its first year of operation, while eliminating the false positives that had plagued customers using traditional security platforms. Major financial institutions were licensing our technology to enhance their own fraud detection capabilities, creating revenue streams that had transformed TechFlow from a regional competitor into a global industry leader. The personal financial rewards had been extraordinary. My equity position in TechFlow had appreciated to a value that exceeded my lifetime earning potential at any traditional corporate role. More importantly, the equity represented ownership in technology that I had created, rather than compensation for work that others would ultimately control. I had learned the importance of maintaining ownership over my innovations, ensuring that future contributions would benefit me directly rather than enriching executives who didn't understand their value. But the financial success was secondary to the professional vindication that came from industry recognition of Guardian Protocol's technical superiority. Independent testing by payment processing associations had confirmed that our fraud detection accuracy exceeded any existing system by substantial margins. Academic researchers were studying our algorithms as examples of how machine learning could be applied effectively to real-world security challenges. Patent applications based on Guardian Protocol's innovations were being approved regularly, establishing intellectual property portfolios that would protect our competitive advantages for decades. The technology sector's response to my story had been particularly gratifying. Dozens of articles in trade publications had analyzed the strategic mistakes that led to Streamline App's decline, using my termination as a case study in how poor technical leadership could destroy valuable corporate assets. Business schools were incorporating the PaySwift collapse into their curricula as an example of how non-technical executives could mismanage critical technology decisions with catastrophic consequences. Harvard Business School had invited me to guest lecture in their MBA program about intellectual property strategy and technical talent management. The irony of teaching Harvard students about the mistakes made by Brad Thompson, himself a Harvard MBA, was delicious. During the lecture, I had emphasized that business education without technical understanding was increasingly dangerous in technology-driven industries, where the most valuable assets were often intangible and easily misunderstood by traditional managers. The lecture had sparked heated discussions among the MBA students about the proper relationship between business leadership and technical expertise. Several students challenged my assertion that technical competence should be required for executives managing technology companies, arguing that business skills were more important than coding ability. I had responded by pointing to Streamline App's stock price, which had fallen an additional 20% since my keynote was announced, as evidence that markets eventually punish companies that undervalue technical talent. Dr. Morrison had attended the Harvard lecture and afterward shared her observations about how the technology transfer landscape was evolving in response to cases like mine. Universities were becoming more aggressive about protecting the intellectual property rights of their researchers, recognizing that academic innovations were often more valuable than corporate administrators realized. The traditional model of licensing university research to established companies was being supplemented by direct commercialization efforts that allowed inventors to maintain greater control over their work. Arizona State University had used the royalties from Guardian Protocol licensing to establish the Maya Rodriguez Fellowship for Women in Engineering, a program that provided full funding for female graduate students pursuing research in machine learning and cybersecurity. The fellowship included not only tuition and living expenses but also legal education about intellectual property rights and entrepreneurship training that would help recipients avoid the pitfalls I had encountered early in my career. The fellowship program had attracted exceptional candidates from around the world, creating a pipeline of technically skilled women who understood both the opportunities and challenges of building careers in male-dominated technology industries. Several fellowship recipients had already begun developing promising research projects that could become the foundation for their own companies or licensing agreements. The program was becoming a model for other universities seeking to support underrepresented groups in technology fields. My parents had attended the fellowship announcement ceremony at Arizona State, where university officials had praised their daughter's contributions to both technological innovation and educational advancement. Seeing my mother and father recognized as the family behind one of Arizona's most successful technology entrepreneurs was deeply meaningful, validating the sacrifices they had made to support my education and career aspirations. The restaurant they had built was now thriving, with the help of payment processing technology I had designed specifically for small businesses facing the challenges they had endured for decades. Corazón restaurant had become something of a pilgrimage site for technology entrepreneurs interested in understanding the personal motivations behind Guardian Protocol's development. Food bloggers and tech journalists regularly visited to interview my parents about raising a daughter who had revolutionized payment security while maintaining strong connections to her working-class roots. The publicity had increased the restaurant's customer base substantially, allowing my parents to expand their operation and hire additional staff from the local Latino community. The broader impact on Austin's technology ecosystem had been significant. TechFlow's success had attracted venture capital investment and talented engineers to the city, strengthening its position as a major technology hub outside of Silicon Valley. Several former Streamline Apps employees had started their own companies using knowledge gained from observing both Guardian Protocol's development and PaySwift's decline. The competitive dynamics that emerged from one company's catastrophic mismanagement had ultimately benefited the entire regional economy. Streamline Apps itself had become a cautionary tale that was studied throughout the technology industry. The company had never recovered from the security breach and subsequent customer exodus that followed Vaultcore's collapse. After burning through their remaining cash reserves attempting to develop a replacement fraud detection system, they had filed for bankruptcy protection and begun liquidating their assets. The intellectual property portfolio that had once been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars was sold to competitors for a fraction of its previous worth. Brad Thompson had disappeared from the technology industry entirely after being terminated from Streamline Apps. Industry colleagues reported that he had moved to the East Coast and taken a position with a traditional manufacturing company where his lack of technical understanding would be less problematic. The Harvard MBA that had once opened doors throughout Silicon Valley was now associated with one of the most spectacular management failures in recent technology history. Jessica Chen had flourished at TechFlow, rising to become the lead architect for Guardian Protocol's international expansion initiatives. Her experience with both PaySwift's decline and Guardian Protocol's success had made her one of the most sought-after experts in payment security architecture. Several universities had offered her positions teaching graduate courses in financial technology, recognizing that her practical experience provided insights that pure academic research couldn't match. Marcus Johnson had been promoted to CEO of TechFlow as the company expanded beyond its original payment processing focus into broader financial services and cybersecurity applications. Under his leadership, the company had gone public with a valuation that exceeded $2 billion, making it one of the most successful IPOs in the financial technology sector. Marcus frequently credited our collaboration on Guardian Protocol as the foundation for everything TechFlow had achieved subsequently. The IPO had created substantial wealth for TechFlow's early employees, including several engineers who had joined the company after leaving Streamline Apps during its decline. The financial success had validated their decision to abandon a sinking ship in favor of a company that valued technical excellence over corporate politics. Many of them had used their newfound wealth to start their own ventures or invest in other technology companies developing innovative solutions to complex problems. The network of women in technology that had emerged from my experience had grown into a formal organization called Tech Equity, which provided legal resources, career guidance, and financial support for female engineers facing workplace discrimination or intellectual property theft. The organization had successfully intervened in dozens of cases where women's technical contributions were being minimized or stolen, establishing precedents that strengthened protections for all underrepresented groups in technology fields. Tech Equity had also become an influential voice in policy discussions about intellectual property reform and corporate governance in technology companies. Our advocacy efforts had contributed to new regulations requiring public companies to disclose the technical qualifications of executives making technology-related decisions. The reforms were designed to prevent situations like the one that had destroyed Streamline Apps, where non-technical managers could eliminate critical technical talent without understanding the consequences. The organization's success had attracted support from major technology companies seeking to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts. Several firms had partnered with Tech Equity to provide mentorship programs, internship opportunities, and funding for research projects led by women and underrepresented minorities. The partnerships had created career pathways that bypassed traditional corporate hierarchies, where technical contributions were often undervalued or misattributed. As I concluded my keynote address at the Global FinTech Innovation Summit, I reflected on how dramatically my professional circumstances had changed since that humiliating afternoon when security had escorted me from Streamline Apps headquarters. The technology that Brad Thompson had dismissed as outdated had become the foundation for innovations that were reshaping an entire industry. The engineer he had eliminated as deadweight was now recognized as one of the most influential leaders in financial technology. The standing ovation from 3,000 industry professionals was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that my success had been built on merit rather than politics, on technical excellence rather than corporate maneuvering. Brad had taught me that talent alone wasn't sufficient protection against incompetent management, but I had learned that talent combined with strategic thinking and legal awareness could overcome even the most unfair circumstances. The questions from audience members revealed how broadly my story had resonated throughout the technology community. Engineers from around the world shared their own experiences with managers who didn't understand the technologies they were responsible for overseeing. Many expressed gratitude for my willingness to fight back publicly rather than accepting injustice quietly, noting that my example had inspired them to be more assertive about protecting their own contributions and rights. During the networking reception following my presentation, I was approached by representatives from venture capital firms, technology companies, and academic institutions interested in collaborating on future projects. The opportunities were diverse and exciting, ranging from developing cybersecurity solutions for government agencies to creating educational programs that would train the next generation of payment security experts. Each conversation reinforced my recognition that being fired from Streamline Apps had actually liberated me to pursue innovations that would have been impossible within traditional corporate constraints. The evening concluded with a private dinner hosted by the conference organizers, where I had the opportunity to meet with other keynote speakers and industry leaders who had shaped the evolution of financial technology over the past decade. The conversations revealed how my story had become part of the industry's collective memory, serving as both inspiration for technical professionals and warning for executives who might be tempted to undervalue technical expertise. As I returned to my hotel room that night, I opened my laptop to review messages that had accumulated during the conference. Among them was a brief note from Brad Thompson, the first communication I had received from him since his termination from Streamline Apps over a year earlier. The message was simple: "Congratulations on your keynote. I was wrong about everything. You deserved better." The apology was too little and too late to change anything that had happened, but it represented acknowledgement from the person who had caused so much damage that his actions had been fundamentally wrong. I deleted the message without responding, recognizing that Brad Thompson was now irrelevant to my future, while remaining forever linked to the mistakes that had made my success possible. Looking ahead, the opportunities were limitless. Guardian Protocol continued evolving with new capabilities that would maintain our competitive advantages for years to come. Tech Equity was expanding internationally to support women in technology throughout the global economy. The fellowship program at Arizona State was producing brilliant researchers who would drive the next wave of innovations in cybersecurity and financial technology. The girl from Mesa, who had learned to code on a secondhand laptop while helping her parents count restaurant receipts, had become a technology leader whose innovations were protecting billions of dollars in transactions worldwide. The journey had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had ultimately vindicated everything I had believed about the power of technical excellence and the importance of perseverance in the face of injustice. Brad Thompson's attempt to eliminate outdated technology had instead eliminated his own relevance while creating space for innovations that would define the industry's future. His lesson in corporate reality had become my education in strategic thinking, teaching me that success required not just technical competence, but also the wisdom to protect and leverage that competence effectively. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was complete. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.